Good morning, everybody. I'm Corey Mason. We'll be moderating this panel discussion this morning. We have lots of questions here and not a lot of time to cover them, so we're going to jump right in. And we will have some handheld mics we'll pass around here when we get that rolling. But just a couple of things that I wanted to cover as we move into the session here, as you can all read on your agenda there very clearly. The discussion is aimed at the challenges in Texas to monitoring and managing CWD. As such, I have some general questions for the panel at large that we're going to kind of move around and just ask some various perspectives, obviously from the geographic as well as different philosophical paradigms that will be brought up here, as well as some very specific questions that are raised from the audience. And so, full disclosure, I have a stack of questions about that thick. I had to synthesize those down to try to look for similarities where we could, try to combine those and provide some questions with the most substance as well to really maximize the time that we had. So that's how we'll try to best use that. As we move forward, just a couple of things that I wanted to do to kind of set the stage. We've obviously heard from the nation's experts over the last day and a quarter at this point. We heard a number of themes that continue to resonate from each and every one of these presenters in various ways. A couple of those I'm going to mention here as we kind of to frame the questions. To start with, a number of them stated that there's evidence of geographic spread and that distribution of CWD is beyond natural expansion. Secondly, they demonstrated and showed numerous examples of population impacts to white-tailed deer, mule deer, and elk. We've been reminded that with population impacts to these said species, there will obviously be impacts to hunters, and that's the hunting that occur in these respective states. Deer hunting in Texas is very important. It's a way of life for us. It's also important economically, 800,000 hunters, $2+ billion economic impact. It affects the state in many ways. Texas also offers many opportunities for management that does not occur, or certainly not in the aggregate, that many other states don't offer. A few examples of these: DMP, release of deer into the wild and allow to commingle with free-range deer, private translocations, a 5-month deer season, permit issuance beyond allotted tags at the individual level, baiting and feeding, we heard that numerous times by speakers, antemortem testing, visited this morning, allow laypersons to collect samples versus accredited vets in many states, various methods used for permitting programs associated with deer capture and transfer. Some of these include things like net gunning, Triple T, and TTP. We've also been reminded by a number of speakers that there's much at stake here for this conversation, and that we must take the long view, and we're going to visit that question here specifically in just a little bit. What does that mean? We're reminded that CW impacts are measured in decades, not in years, not in 5-year period, but 10, 20, 50 years. A number of speakers reminded us of that from our respective state perspectives. We've also had some examples of HD work that showed specific examples of hunters that potentially said they would stop hunting at high enough disease prevalence. At the same time, 50+% of those hunters admitted that they had poor knowledge and understanding of CWD. All of these things should shape and form the way that we message these, and messaging is important. We should choose our words carefully. We heard that from a number of speakers yesterday. CWD has not only economic cost, but also social cost. And these environmental reservoirs that we're going to visit a little bit here in a second are long-term, and as such, our management actions and plans should also be long-term in strategy and philosophy. Lastly, prevention is cheaper and easier than fighting an established disease. So with that caveat, we're going to jump right into some questions here. Obviously, we have a stage full of people, and we're going to pass a couple of mics around as we go. We'll have some panel discussions and some very specific discussions as we go here. So the first question, we heard carcass disposal many times in many presentations, and carcass disposal was mentioned as one of the leading causes potentially as a movement of the disease. So I'm going to ask anyone on the panel that would be willing to take this one, or maybe a couple of people, can you please describe the process between how a positive carcass and a healthy deer can contract CWD? And as well, what practices need to be put in place, considering the scope and size of a state like Texas, where we have many areas in which CWD has not been detected, as well as areas that CWD has been detected, and how do you basically monitor and ensure that deer carcass movement isn't one of the primary vectors of moving the disease in the state? Who would like to tackle that one?
The reason I'm going to sort of address this is I was involved in a couple of papers where we looked at scavenger, both avian and mammalian movement of positive material through their GI tract. Okay, so based on work that we did in a controlled setting. So scavengers kind of go for the low-hanging fruit on carcasses, we know that. So eyes and the anus. Well, guess what? When an animal is terminal, both of those areas are pretty full of infectious material. So we wanted to kind of find out what happens when one of these scavenger type picks up the material. And it goes kind of through them. It goes in the front and out the back. So when we think about disposal of carcasses, whether it's in a hunting situation where people are chucking them out in the back 40 or along the roadside, we've seen all of that, right? To producers also having dead piles on their property, this is one of the things that I've been on a bandwagon for a while about, is I hate that. So we don't want that material available to these scavengers. Do we know definitively that they're responsible for movement of infectivity? No. I mean, that would be very difficult to address. But why do we want to provide the opportunity for that to happen? So I think that it's everybody's responsibility to make sure that those body parts and pieces are not left in a situation that could happen. So I don't know if I addressed all of that question. It was pretty large. What did I miss?
As far as practices to be able to efficiently monitor carcass disposal in a state the size of Texas?
You know, that is out of my expertise. So, yeah, someone from a state agency perhaps could address that far better than.
I'll take a stab at it and say that, we've been having this carcass disposal conversation. I think one of the most important things for a state to look at is, do you have regulations in place that are currently encouraging folks to move carcasses around, or at least discouraging them from processing them and quartering them out? And I think about regulations such as proof of sex, which requires you to maintain the head attached to the carcass, or some other reproductive parts, which is a barrier to somebody going ahead and fully quartering out the animal and leaving that carcass on the property in which the animal was harvested. So in that context, I think that's an important thing that we need to, as state wildlife agencies that are putting regulations into place, think about what we have that might be prohibiting kind of that don't move the carcass.
I could add to that too. I guess in Wisconsin, we have regulations that basically we try to maintain the carcass waste in the county of origin or an adjacent county, and we strongly encourage that waste ends up in a landfill. So either landfilling directly by the hunter, or when they take their carcasses to taxidermists or meat processors, we do have regulations in place that require those taxidermists and meat processors to properly dispose of their deer waste and landfilling. So looking at it from that level, I mean, it's a hard thing to monitor. I know part of the question is how do you assure that those regulations are being adhered to, and really that's a difficult thing to do in the state of Wisconsin, or certainly in a large state like Texas. So a lot of it is just outreach and education, and then having the awareness and enhanced awareness out there. And hunters tend to regulate themselves, and if people aren't following those rules and regulations, they'll be reported typically, and then that's where the law enforcement comes in.
Thank you.
So back to sort of one of the original part of the question, which was what are the risks to deer from carcasses? So about a decade ago, we did a study to find out what happens to carcasses that are placed out in the wild, and gut piles as well, because certainly gut piles from infectious deer have infectious material as well. So they tend to decompose, at least in our sort of situation in Wisconsin. They tend to either be scavenged or decompose within about 30 to 60 days. And I think the other thing that we're worried about that decomposition is that potentially those prions get into the soil where deer could consume them, and they could also then be potentially go into plants that are in that area as well. I don't think we have science to really demonstrate that that occurs in the wild yet, but there's been enough science in the labs, I think, to demonstrate that that's a possibility. And so it is definitely a risk we should be aware of. And I think coming around to the scavengers, there's another thing that we should be aware of about prion diseases that we just sort of need to keep our eye on, is that we have these things called species barriers. And we know that it's hard to jump species barriers for prion disease typically. But we don't know enough about the ecology of the scavengers and things and what their risks might be to get prion diseases as well. And that has some ecological implications, which I think we need to probably more information about. We know some species don't need to seem to be susceptible, like raccoons. Canids are not susceptible, so coyotes, foxes, wolves. Birds are not susceptible, but there are other species that and voles apparently are. So there's other species we need to know more about in terms of what the long-term ecology of prions in the environment is.
Thank you, Dr. Sandra. So the next question is a question for each one on the panel, and we're just going to start and work our way around 1 or 2 minutes each, I ask, basically acknowledging that today's decisions regarding CWD will not be validated or invalidated for a period of time, decades again likely. What should our thinking and planning for this long-term look like in Texas? And specifically, please also address stakeholder input in that. So if we could just walk around and provide some perspectives there.
So in the long term, I mean, from my perspective at least, I'm not a disease biologist, I'm a social scientist. I would consider what are the implications for hunter participation. I think that's one of the major considerations about how CWD could potentially influence, you know, agencies' budgets. And I think planning for that's going to be something that's particularly important. And you know, stakeholder engagement is kind of the name of the game when it comes to participation. Figuring out, you know, how to engage the public more appropriately. The media channels for messaging about CWD are particularly important, I think. And that's something that Texas is going to have to think about, as well as every other state agency that's influenced by CWD.
So I guess sort of the message I try to give people these days about CWD is that, well, first, beyond the prevention I think is the first key. But once you get the disease, I think it's really, I would argue that it's critical to find the disease very early on, because that's the time when we know we have the best opportunity to do something about the disease. If we're aggressive enough and act quickly enough, we have a potential to actually eliminate the disease, sort of the New York example. And I think there are other examples as well that we probably haven't really brought to the fore. I think once you get beyond that stage, once the disease becomes established, I think what you want to be able to do is try to contain the disease as much as you can and try to lower the impact of the disease on our deer populations. And the way we can do that in a couple of ways, potentially. None of them, so the biology indicates several things we can do, none of which are very popular, and that's the problem. So we want to reduce prevalence of this disease because that's the driver of future infection. And the higher prevalence gets, the more rapid the disease is going to grow. In addition, since prevalence is a key driver, well, prevalence also gets higher in dispersing animals, particularly yearling males. And so as prevalence gets higher, it's more likely that the disease is going to spread faster as well. So reducing prevalence is a real key to try to control it. If you can't do that, another possibility, at least to try to contain it, is to try to reduce herd size so you're having fewer infected dispersers leaving the population and spreading it around. So I think those are the kind of things that I would like to sort of see people try to implement more. I don't know that we have the management strategies down to do that, but we need to sort of experiment with it and figure out better strategies to do those kind of things.
On a landowner and hunter level and the interactions that I have with other hunters, I mean, those things that I said, you know, buy time, pay for science. Another thing I like to say, it's not ours, it's just our turn. I do have concerns about, real concerns about the future. When I talk about big bucks, sometimes I feel like in our big buck management, I feel like I need to raise my hand and say, hi, I'm Doug, I used to be into big bucks. And then sort of take back from that. One of the things that we really work on our property is celebrating every deer. Doesn't matter if it's a little buck, it doesn't matter if it's a doe, it doesn't matter if it's a nubbin buck. That each one of those is the life of that animal is as important as the next. And that's an attitude change that we've had. It's a cultural change that we've had, but the value of the animal and the value of hunting into the future is the kind of message that I've been trying to deliver to folks, and one that I had to learn myself. 12, 13 years ago, if Tammy had come to me and said, hey, we got to kill all the deer on your farm and everybody around you, I'd probably add a few more questions. I still have a lot of questions, but I have fewer of them now.
So I would say sustainable strategies for management of CWD, and the way that you're going to get there, the best way to get there most likely is when you involve your stakeholders, and you do that on a regular basis and bring them along with you in your process and do regular check-ins and involve those stakeholders on a regular basis and form those relationships and those partnerships to sustain it into the future. Regular check-ins on your management plan and involving your public.
So the thing I think is important, and it obviously I have a little bit biased of a perspective, but I think we should increase more testing, do more testing, do testing faster, make testing cheaper, and make testing more easily available to the hunters. I think that'll allow participation to continue if there's a reliable, inexpensive, and fast way for hunters to get results. I think that's the case in some states. I saw the turnaround rate in Wisconsin is really good, but in other states I think it's really slow. And I think another option for hunters to submit samples themselves, or a way to increase the testing in captive and wild animals in a higher throughput format and less expensively would allow earlier detection of CWD when it pops up. So those are some of the things I'm working on. I think that would be one thing that would help the future of CWD.
I think it's a two-part thing. Education and research. We gotta educate our public out there and our hunters is why we're doing it, why we're asking them to do these things. At the same time, we need the research to back up or to support what do we do when we find disease. We do all this surveillance. We love to do surveillance, but what good does it do us once we find disease? We got to have solutions, and that's where we need to get to. And I think of that movie, I don't know how many of you seen it, Martian, where that astronaut was stuck on Mars there and got left there, and he said, we need to science the heck out of this, to survive it. And I think that's what we really need to do here at CWD today is we need to science the heck out of this to find a solution. So when you have that disease, when you find that new discovery, or maybe it's an old discovery that you just now found, but what do we do now? And at the same time, we got to be careful that we're just not doing something for the sake of doing it. I'm the first guy to stand up and scream about carcass disposal and not in my backyard, don't be dumping them in my backyard. But at the same time, the truth and reality is these deer are dying of a lot of things, and they're dying on the landscape right now, and those animals are going back into the landscape, they're being scavenged, and we can't prevent that. So, we don't want to make the problems worse. At the same time, we don't want to be a feel-good and think we're doing something just because all of a sudden we stopped all this carcass transportation. One thing we got to be careful, because we're all hunters and tied to the hunting industry, is that we don't make it too difficult to hunt. So we got to have a solution. If it's carcass transportation or carcass disposal, well, what's the easy way to do it? I, as a hunter, more deer are shot at that last minute or 2 minutes of daylight than any time in the day. And, my part of the country, it can be 10 below, and all of a sudden now I got a cape of deer out on the spot, out in the middle of the prairie or in a snowstorm. What do? There's got to be solutions. We don't want to make it too difficult for people. So that's the challenge, and hopefully people down the way here got the answer, but we really do need to have a solution other than what we're doing.
I can't disagree with much that has been said. On Sean's point there, we were having a sidebar discussion a while ago, and you have strategies that on the surface appear to be maybe the right strategy to employ, but ultimately, if it doesn't incentivize someone to stay engaged, hunters to stay engaged, producers to collect samples, then really you're not getting the information you need on the distribution and prevalence of the disease. So we need to think about the real-world implications of a change in regulations and play that out through time to make sure that we are going to have hunters and landowners and all of our stakeholders stay engaged in the process as opposed to throwing their hands up. The other thing that I think about from Corey, from the way you presented that, was the long-term aspect of this. We can get frustrated because we don't see any research at hand right now that necessarily provides a solution. But as Doug said, you know, we need to buy time. Our team is looking at a long-term study where we can take some of these concepts, we can look in the field where we have CWD, and actually look at management practices and see if we can determine which management practices out there may be exacerbating the problems, or maybe which harvest strategies are helping mitigate. That answer is not going to come about in a 2 or 3 year study, but because the disease is slow to progress, I think we need to have some vision there and invest in the long term, knowing that the solution may not necessarily come in 2 or 3 or 4 years, but hopefully we do have some solutions so that our kids and our grandkids and those that enjoy deer, we will have some solutions for them.
This question's what keeps a lot of us awake at night, knowing that it'll probably be decades before we see the results of our actions or inactions in response to this disease. It's a scary thought. Clearly, I think early detection is critical. And so, as Davin and some others have said, testing a lot is critical for early detection. I'm hopeful that there's a solution out there, or maybe solutions out there, that we just aren't aware of yet. And so we are proud to contribute as much as we can to the science, to research projects out there. We have opportunities here to collaborate on projects, and so we do so. We provide samples and whatever we can from these opportunities we have at hand to try and learn more about this. And so, just like much as what's been said so far, we can't back away from the research on this, on learning more about this, but we also need to continually share the knowledge that we do have on this disease and educate more so we get more support, so we can get quicker so we can begin to find that solution quicker.
Yeah, I completely agree with your comment, and I think that is very important to have early detection, but not only on the animals, but also in the environment. You can identify the animals that are infected, but what happened with the areas that house them. So it is important to have a sensitive detection method, not only on the animals, but also on the environment. And prion diseases are not so popular, I will say, in funding agencies. So every effort that we made in research, the idea is that is as meaningful as possible. So samples, this is from the researcher's perspective, is what I will say is important for us, meaningful samples. So we can model a lot of things in the laboratory, but if we can get the real thing, the real samples that are collected from the farms, it will be better. It will provide more meaningful results, and hopefully will advance much better on early detection method that will lead to preventive measurements.
So from a national, federal, voluntary servant health program perspective, we will continue to support the state of Texas in any efforts that we are able to do. We have limitations, of course, and that, of course, is always money for things like indemnity and supporting work, but we will do our very best to support the state officials and their efforts in any way we're able.
In 2004, there was a document put together called the Multi-State Guidelines, and it was put together by folks from the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. 26 state directors out of 50. I don't know whether Texas was one of them. I assume maybe you were. Maybe Clayton, you know that. Put together a working paper on not too detailed management theory, practices that may be employed to deal with CWD. And you could replace the name CWD with any other disease of wildlife, of domestic livestock, or of humans, and use these same principles. And so the first principle was active monitoring, and we've talked about that a lot. Early detection, how important it is, because if you're going to have a chance with this disease, it's going to be early. The next thing is don't make it any worse. Don't move it around. And we've talked a little bit about, identifying these potential anthropogenic risk factors. How could people inadvertently move infectious agents around and then address that, right? The third is, to address disease. Try to influence disease dynamics where it occurs. In other words, manage disease. And Dr. Samuel has talked about this a little bit, and he's published actively, on that topic. So actively dealing with disease where it occurs. The next one is quite simple, and Doug talked about it as well. Support research. Buy time. Pay for research. And the last is engage stakeholders regularly, almost continuously, with accurate scientific information. Keep them in the loop about what you're doing. So I think those principles, obviously that didn't tell you how to do or what to do, but if you followed those generic disease management principles, I think you'll be in the best possible position you can for both the short, medium, and long term.
Okay, from the thoughts I have off the top of my head are early detection. Obviously, in order to stomp it out, we need early detection. I believe we're working on that. We want to continue our cooperation with the state agencies, Texas Parks and Wildlife, our agency, Animal Health Commission, as well as the landowners and the industry groups. We need to continue that cooperation and also strive to do better education and outreach in that regard. Also, I think it would be interesting to do an economic impact study to the industry for captive cervid owners with positive herds. I'm also interested in the geographic spread between captive herds and the local native wildlife or the native herd, and if there's something we can mitigate to protect the native herd in that respect. And I think that's something important that we need to continue to work on. And then also when we, similar to what Clayton said, as far as risky practices within herds, what are those? I think he's considering hunter-harvest level, but also within captive herds, what are the risky practices? Is there ways to do biosecurity when you have a disease where the animal is shedding prions daily over time? What can we do as far as that goes in preventing spread within a facility?
Well, I guess I would start with going back to my concluding slide from yesterday, which is really the management options are fairly limited with chronic wasting disease, so you really have to do everything in your power to prevent CWD from getting into new populations. Other people have said that on the stage as well. And then I'd actually have to agree with Sean on this one. I think that after that, it's a matter of research and education. Coming from a state that's had CWD for a long time, dealing with the hunters at least 5 years ago, this may have changed now, but I found a fairly high level of apathy about chronic wasting disease. When I would ask hunters if I could test their animals, oftentimes they'd say, I've been hunting in this draw for 30 years, I'm sure I've eaten a positive, I'm not that worried about it. Or a level of naivete, where they just didn't know that CWD was even in the area, even though it had been there for 30 plus years. So I think public education is really important, and you guys are at that nascent stage right now where you can mold your messaging still with the public, particularly the hunting public. And then finally with research, learn everything you can about the epidemiology of CWD in Texas. I think that's going to be important as well. Hopefully come up with adequate management options.
So lots and lots of good suggestions up here. What I would say would be also to learn from those who came before you. Many of the different jurisdictions that have had CWD have done a number of different things on the ground, and there's a lot to be learned. I continue to learn from other states that are doing things, and I think we may have done somewhat of a disservice today in not necessarily talking about the plethora of information out there. You know, there have been management attempts done by Wisconsin, by Illinois. A lot of work's been done in Colorado and Alberta. And there's actually quite a bit of data out there to suggest that there are some things that we could probably do to help alleviate the situation with chronic wasting disease. The problem, of course, is that it's really hard to sustain some of that management, and we just haven't been able to do it in most places long enough for us to really determine whether or not that works. And the reality is we're not going to necessarily find something that works from a management standpoint until we try some things, and we try some things in a way that sets us up to measure our results and hopefully be successful. So we're going to have to take a leap of faith to some degree to go out there and try some management and work together and try to learn collectively what things we can do, at least from a state management agency perspective, to help the situation with chronic wasting disease, and then hope that we get more information and more tools to more directly manage the disease in the future.
So the curse of going last, everybody's had really, really great ideas. I guess two things that come to mind. One is I think we need to better communicate what Carter referenced yesterday morning in the fact that the white-tailed deer is the goose that laid the golden egg that drives wildlife conservation in North America, and has and hopefully will continue to. So unless that system changes, we need to sell the why of the importance of the white-tailed deer in our overall conservation mission, the economic impacts, why it is critically important that we invest nationally, state level, the resources in order to manage it. So that's kind of a long-term approach. Putting on my administrator hat, you know, I think recommendation for Texas Parks and Wildlife would be that we need to ensure that we're not treating chronic wasting disease as an incident anymore. We typically, at least in my agency, have viewed it as an incident, so we've treated it in a triage manner. And that's not sustainable to the health of staff and the health of the agency. And so ensure that you start to put the things into place that make it truly a program that is sustaining itself. And hopefully that dedication of staff and resources starts to open up opportunities to think freely, to think outside the box. We move out of the triage mindset and start to think about how we build some of these long-term collaborations and partnerships that will help make this thing sustainable. So yeah, from a state agency, I think figure out how you make it operational instead of a triage incident kind of situation.
Thank you, panelists, for that. Continuing to move on, a question from the floor. This question will be for two people. We'll start with Brian Richards, and then we'll move to Sean Schaefer. What do you see as the biggest gaps in knowledge and related priority research needs for CWD?
Well, that's a deep question. You sure Sean can't go first? So I always think, and I think Mike Samuel would concur with me a bit, that if we had a better understanding of the role the environment plays in mediating, moderating transmission. I mean, we see in different places in North America, CWD has responded quite differently through time, much more than we would predict based on the species or the density or the animal management properties. So, I mean, Mike talked a little bit yesterday about, you know, theoretically maybe at some point in an outbreak, in an infection, that transmission moves away from direct and more into indirect transmission. And we don't really have a good understanding of the factors involved. So I think if we could learn more about how epidemics or work through time, work through decades, so we could better understand how this thing works on the ground would be highly important. Number two, I alluded to it just very briefly yesterday. If there's, in my mind, and it's a very strange place to be in my mind, especially at 3 o'clock in the morning when you wake up thinking about CWD, vaccine research is critically important. That if there is a silver bullet that we're going to find, that I think that's got to be the way. I'm not sure that anything else holds as much promise, but yet we're very much at the infancy of, vaccine research. But, if we're going to find something, that's where we need to go. I'm going to echo something that Dr. Wood said a minute ago, and it's based out of a document that she was a co-author on. It's called the Adaptive Management Guidelines for Chronic Wasting Disease in the Western States. It's a document put out by the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies earlier this year, and I encourage everybody to download it and take a look at it. And one of the things they're talking about is, we're likely not going to get this thing, we're not going to get rid of it, but there are things that responsible management agencies can do if they have support in order to keep this from becoming a worst case scenario, from losing this treasured natural resource that we're here for. And it will take trying some of these experimental management procedures. I think we know some things, how we could manage CWD, how we could impact the course of disease on the ground. It's just that we have not been able to sustain those efforts. So I echo what Dr. Wood said. We need to figure out a way that we can implement some of these procedures, and some of them sound quite draconian, pretty nasty. Male-focused harvest, hotspot culling, things like that some of the states have tried. We need to be able to implement these things on a long-term basis to really see how do populations with high prevalence levels react to these sustained management practices. We know they don't respond well when you only do it for 2-3 years, but how do they respond if you do it for a decade? So I guess to me those are kind of some key things that I'd be a proponent of.
Ditto. I tell you, it is scary though that, and maybe it's because Brian and I have traveled, this country for the last 20 years, probably doing this. But I was going to say basically the same things. I look at it as transmission and treatment, and I don't want this. I look at it different though. I think than Brian. I think we're saying the same thing, but differently. And the neat thing about this is, is CWD is getting to be the flavor of the day again. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But I remember, in 1998 when Congress threw $19 million at this. Everybody was studying CWD. We'd go to our U.S. Animal Health Association meetings, and the chicken people were doing CWD research. I mean, everybody was doing it because there was money there, and they followed the money. Right now, nobody is wanting to do CWD research because there's no money. Congress right now, and it's due to a lot of the sportsmen's groups in this room, Congress is looking at several different bills, or a couple different bills, to fund research. Also looking at another bill to do transmission studies. And I think there's so much about this that we don't know. And I mentioned earlier the alternative science, the alternative prion theories. I think we all speak about prions, but and one of you scientists, please correct me if I'm totally wrong on this, but I believe it's the prion that misfolds and causes the hole and makes the damage. I don't know that it's the prion that causes that to happen. It's the prion that all of us have in us. All of us have prions in us. So it's what is causing that prion to do that. What causes that prion to go rogue? And I think that's what we need, and I think that's kind of the challenge that's being given to the National Institute of Science or something. We need to do some major studies to find out how is this disease moving. We heard a lot about carcass transportation this week, and we've heard about the breeding industry and movement of deer. I can tell you the White Sands Missile Range did not bring many carcasses onto that facility. No breeder deer were ever brought to the White Sands Missile Range. They got a lot of CWD. This disease is around the country in places that makes no sense. We look at this carcass transportation, but what about the alfalfa we talked about? What about these waste management? We're in a perfect spot here to be talking about this. These compost piles. What are we doing with all these roadkill deer? These compost piles, a lot of those end up in potting soil and various decorative things that people put out in their yards, and then these old ladies are planting, old men, whoever, are planting these flowers and decorative flowers. And we go to Lansing, Michigan right now, and they got a lot of CWD within the city limits of Lansing. Those white-tailed deer are living on the petunias and everything else they're planted around them houses. Where is that disease coming from? So I think we really need to look at transmission. What is truly causing it to spread? How is it spread? are we going to go back, maybe it's an Adam and Eve type question here, but do we truly believe that this started in one deer in Fort Collins, Colorado, and now spread to Finland in a moose? Or is it already naturally occurring always here? We can spread it, we can move it. Don't misunderstand me there, but we need to truly look at that is, what is the transmission of this disease? How is it moved? Where's it moved? And from there, treatment. The vaccine part of it, and I don't know, Mary didn't touch on it yesterday, but it failed miserably. They actually had more CWD in the vaccinated than the non-vaccinated. But there also is another study, the one out of New York, and when I look at it from a farmer perspective, I think they gave them like 8 boosters over, 9 months or something. I mean, it was a lot of boosters, a lot of shots, and at the end of the day, they all came down with the disease, but like 2 of them or something were way delayed. All of them were delayed, but there was a step in the right direction. Was it a success? No. But they did something that nobody else had done before. They did delay the disease. They slowed it down. I would say it was progress. So we need to look at that. I probably disagree with Brian a little bit. I don't know that that's, especially vaccinating. We do it with rabies, I guess, but vaccinating wildlife is hard. So I think we got to still look at alternatives. The genetic resistance, I think, is a big thing. We got to come up with other solutions as well too. But treatment. So when you do find the disease, what are you going to do about it? That's a big thing.
Thank you. Next question is for Dr. Nichols. Been various discussions on the expansion of CWD, versus just now finding it via test. Can you determine how long CWD has been in an area with newly found cases? And do you believe that it's always been in Texas and or are we just now finding it as it expands?
Okay, so that's a very long, complicated question. I'll hope that I'll hit on all the parts. So how do we know how long it's been in place? That's a little tricky. In wild animals, I think that's nigh impossible to some degree because you don't know how many have died that you didn't see that died out in the woods somewhere. Just because you found that first one, that doesn't necessarily tell you that there haven't been others before it. So I think that's tricky. In captive situations, we have a little bit of a clue sometimes when we look at the testing post-mortem. So in white-tailed deer, if we have an animal that is lymph node only, we know that it is a more recent case typically than something that has managed to get all the way to the obex, and there's some variability there with genotype. But it gives us a sense about it. So if there's one positive on a site and it's lymph node only, that gives us the sense that, well, this is not something that's probably been there if they've been doing mortality testing. So I will put that caveat on there. Could you repeat the second part of the question?
Sure, you bet. So second part of the question, actually kind of a 3-part question here, but basically, do you believe that it's always been in Texas and or has it been expanded and now being found via test?
This is Tracy's opinion, right? So you can take that and some money and get some coffee. I don't think it's probably always been here in Texas. If that were the case, they've done a significant amount of surveillance in the state. Why hasn't more shown up? Okay, but there could be people that disagree with that, so you can take that for what it's worth. So I don't think it's always been here.
Okay, Dr. Morales, next question is for you here. Excuse me for just using some generalities here. It says your slide showed that an incubation is 7 to 40 years. As such, do you feel that the human health risks have been adequately addressed and studied?
Can you repeat the last part, please?
You bet. Do you feel that the human health risks have been adequately addressed and studied?
Well, actually, the 7 to 40 years is based on different human diseases. The 40 years, that is an extreme long incubation period, is based on a transmissible disease called Kuru that was found in New Guinea, where people used to eat parts of the relatives, and some of these people died from a prion disease, so they were contracting prion disease, and the expected incubation period in those people was about 40 years. So no, there is a lot of questions still on human prion diseases. So we know that most of the human prion diseases, that is Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, appears in a sporadic form. Sporadic means we don't know what is triggering the disease. So in just less than 5% of the cases are familiar. So they are due to a genetic mutation in the prion protein. But the large majority are, as I told you, sporadic. We don't know what is the triggering event causing the disease. So I don't know if that answered the question.
Thank you.
Can I just add something to that real quick?
Yeah,
so this CWD is the closest parallel to BSE. Obviously, the species barrier I think has been established to be less robust between humans and cows compared to people and cows, so more robust between human and deer. However, the BSE case, there were millions of people exposed to the disease, and 200 people died terribly from awful disease. And it seemed to be at random except in one case, and then it was a family in Spain that ate the brain of a cow, where 2 individuals from that same family died of BSE. So that tells me that it has to be a dose issue. That I think it's really important to educate hunters and people who are consuming these deer that there are certain tissues that you should not consume, and just eating the meat is a safer way to go. And I very rarely heard that in any sort of scientific discussion about CWD. So I just thought that was important to mention. I wanted to add that on.
Yeah, just to
can I add a couple things too? That I think probably the best knowledge we have about the incubation time in humans comes from the BSE outbreak. And if you look at the peak of BSE in cattle compared to the distribution of infection in humans, there's about an 8-year lag, 8 to 10 year lag there. And the other thing to point out is that of the 200 some people that died, almost all of them are a particular human genotype. So it seems like this susceptibility issue that seems to transcend almost all species in terms of genotypes as well. There's continuing concern that there are other human genotypes which may have a much longer incubation period from the BSE epidemic, and that's being monitored in Europe. And there is concern that there could be another series of issues or health issues from some of the other genotypes.
Yeah, but it is important to mention too that from BSE, even though from a lot of people that was exposed, just approximately 200 people developed the disease. A retrospective study analyzing tonsils for a large population, they found that a lot of people were incubating the disease, but they didn't develop the disease, so they were silent carriers of prions, and that maybe these people die, without developing the disease, but that doesn't mean that they were not having the prions in their body. So this is also something important to be considered, because in CWD, I'm not saying that this is happening, but it could be a possibility that the people will never develop the disease, but they are carrying the prions. So there is a potential risk over there.
If I could add to it, definitely no expert in the subject, but I can add some information that is out there. The 300 people that ate that CWD positive deer in New York at that fireman feed, CDC is tracking them to this day, and I think that was 2007 maybe, is that correct? But it was a long time ago, and they're being tracked to this day. We know that this disease has been in Colorado, at least since 1967. A lot of people have eaten a lot of animals out of there, and they did, extensive studies out there. I was trying to remember what CWD Symposium it was. I believe it was when I was in Utah. But there was a presentation there as to the dynamics they did in the studying of all the brain diseases of people, and none of them they could correlate or tie to hunters in that area. And then third, I'd like to add that the monkey study up in Canada, they were fed raw venison. And I think the tie into that is, what I mentioned earlier about we don't know how this disease is spread, but if they're, and maybe just normal cooking, we know that the heat doesn't kill it, but maybe there's something that kills the bacteria that does it. We don't know, but for darn sure, eating raw venison is not a natural route of consuming deer normally. So I think that's why maybe that paper has not passed peer review to this day. I know that is a component that was looked at. And last, I'd like to end by saying, as a soldier, Army soldier stationed in Germany, 1987, 1988. I have a letter in my file from the U.S. Health Department saying I can no longer donate blood because the beef that was sourced from the low bidder came from the UK.
Thank you, everybody. Next question's for Clayton. Clayton, given lessons learned from other states, does TPWD plan to continue allowing live movement of cervids? Additionally, does TPWD plan to continue baiting and feeding?
Thanks for the easy questions, Corey. Seriously, I mean, a lot of thought has been given to this, and this is somewhat tied to my previous comment. Little background, if you don't know, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies here recently, our Wildlife Health Committee, which has veterinarians, wildlife health professionals from all the agencies, put together some best management practices. And those best management practices include suggestions to get rid of baiting, feeding, to eliminate live cervid movement, etc. The associate, and I know that some folks in this room have seen that and have asked that question, or even there was a rumor out there on the street, is Texas Parks and Wildlife going to ban baiting and feeding? Some of the background on that particular document and the discussion among the directors, all the directors of those agencies recognize that many of the states are different. Our hunting cultures are different, our practices are different. Each state wants to maintain its own authority and not have these documents prescriptive. And so clearly, in those documents, there are recommendations. I will tell you that, from my perspective for Texas, number one, baiting has been is an integral part of the hunting culture. It doesn't mean that everybody does it, but I can tell you I've killed many deer over corn. And to my point about looking at a practice such as baiting, and to some of the other speakers' points, is if we were to consider a practice like that, or even talking about something like that, the question would be, is it sustainable? Is it supportable? And so from states where baiting is not part of the hunting culture, it's not legal, I think it's very easy for folks to look at that and possibly say we're not going to do it, or we're going to abolish it if it hasn't been in place very long, and they could get support from hunters. I think also in Texas, though, it is a very important harvest tool. And we don't have any stats on how many deer are killed over corn in Texas every year. I'd say most. I think it's easy to say most. And in my mind, the question, some common sense questions would be, if a practice like baiting were abolished, would we in fact reduce our harvest, reduce monitoring, lose support from our hunters? So all that being said, I don't think we should put our head in the sand when it comes to the science, but we've got groups, we have stakeholder groups like our CWD task force with very smart and pragmatic individuals that we actually ask to help us wrestle with these questions, whether it's live deer movement, which is also a very integral part of our deer management culture, or whether it's baiting and feeding. My crystal ball says I don't see us abolishing those practices, but I do think it is also prudent that our advisory committees, our Whitetail Deer Advisory Committee, our CWD Task Force, not ignore the science, and that these be discussion items, and that we should lay the science out on the table, but we should also look at really the downstream implications of such, and really understand that some of these may not necessarily be the silver bullet or a magic solution. And so that's why I think the study that our team is trying to put together, looking at management practices and really seeing what the real impacts are out in the field and on the rangeland, is important. So intensive deer management, deer movement, I think will remain a part of the deer management culture. That doesn't mean that we won't be more diligent in our sampling Doesn't mean that we won't be looking at what the science shows us to help us mitigate that risk to the greatest degree possible. But I also think that we should not be naive enough to think that we can completely get rid of risk, with the imposition of one or two regulations, given the complexity of this disease and what we've learned at this conference.
Thank you. Next question is for Dr. Samuel. You mentioned water as a potential source or possible source of contamination or transmission. Could ponds or troughs be similar to bait sites for transmission?
Well, maybe Tracy would want to answer that because it's her research that showed there was infection in water. But just to give some information first, I think areas where animals are allowed to deposit prions in, like feeding and baiting sites, like mineral licks, like troughs potentially of water, could then provide a source for infection of uninfected animals. In areas where we have free-flowing water or very large bodies of water, we would sort of hope that dilution plays a big role in making that risk a lot less, if probably negligible. But in troughs and things like that, we know that animals are going to stick their noses in it and drink from it and salivate in it. At least they're off the ground in most cases, so they're probably not going to urinate and defecate in it like they would a mineral lick or other things like that. But as I pointed out, saliva is one of the most infectious secretions that we know about in cervids. So that's definitely a potential concern. Probably more of a concern in some of the captive scenarios than in wild, but you guys have some different operations here that probably makes those things more important as well. And maybe Tracy wants to input.
Sure. So in the study that I did years ago on water, I was looking at large bodies of water, and so there was only 1 point high snowmelt runoff in Colorado where I found it. But the question is, what happens in the more concentrated situations, like in our case, Colorado wallows, of course, feeding troughs and so on, and that's a different situation than it coming in with snowmelt runoff. We've partnered with Dr. Morales to try to address that question. So we have begun sampling where we get owners that are willing to participate, where we're sampling various fomites. So those are items within the pens that get contact with the animals. That material is sampled, and his lab is working on developing and optimizing the amplification techniques to try to understand how that looks. And some of, I've seen I go into a lot of sites, and I see a pretty big variety of materials in there, and I'm trying to take photographs of those particular feeders or waters because they look quite different. So some of them are the plastic ball type where they have to compress the ball to drink. Some of them are troughs. Some of them are runoffs. Some of them are vernal runoffs where it only happens, you name it, it's kind of there. So they're going to be different types of substrates that his group is actually going to look at to address that question.
Well, and yesterday I didn't have the chance to show that in detail, but we have seen, at least in the lab setting, that different materials bind differently, and also they have different potentials to transmit to animals. So that, I think that it will be very important to address too.
Thank you. So as Texas is looking forward, this question is for Dr. Wood from a Wyoming perspective. You've noted the importance in messaging. What guidance would you offer to Texas regarding communication efforts?
Boy, I don't know if I'm the right person to ask that, I'm a veterinarian. Communication does not come naturally to me. When it comes to talking to a large body of people and trying to change people's perspective and get support to do something, one-on-one, I do pretty good. But, I think the main thing is to just be open, be upfront, be honest, be transparent. Provide the information and provide the perspectives, but boy, when it comes to how to communicate effectively and how to get support to do things, I gotta be honest, we're still trying to figure out how to do that in Wyoming, and I think that there are probably others on this panel that are gonna be far more able to talk to you about how to communicate effectively than unfortunately I would. But, you know, I do think it's important to keep communicating with your public and to be sure that you're providing the best information you can and being really open and transparent about what you're dealing with. Maybe somebody else on the panel has something better.
I might just add a couple things to that. So education, communication, I think are critical components of a program associated with, you know, CWD management or whatever kind of management an agency is engaged in. But in and of itself, it is never a solution. It's a prerequisite. Having an informed public is the way that we're able to implement science-based programs that people are accepting of. So having that knowledge is critical, but it's just the groundwork. So I would never think of education, communication in and of itself as a solution, but it's a huge part of it, right?
So Doug, would you be willing to comment as well from the hunter's perspective, is the hunter's role in CWD management?
Well, the role is, you know, is fairly obvious that we're the, at least in my area, we're the folks that are, you know, taking the deer out. The hunter-to-hunter conversations are really important. And I alluded to it a little bit that the ability to have whoever it is that's speaking to them, you know, have that trust, and for better or worse, at least in my area, I'm someone that people trust. So that landowner, hunter-to-hunter, you know, trusted source, who can then sort of hand that off. I'd encourage, I guess, recruitment of you know, that sort of things. And in Wisconsin, I think that's one of the things that's happened with our county deer advisory commissions, that you know, folks come in and speak with us, and then we're getting to make some limited decisions. And at least in our county, I know that hunters are feeling way better about information that's being put out there, and their understanding, and then also you know, implementing things, because it's not coming just from, you know, the agency, it's also coming from other hunters.
Thank you.
If I could add to that as well. So is stepping down the communication and action on the landscape from, you know, there's nothing that's more prone to failure than making decisions that aren't involving that community that's being impacted locally. So stepping it down to that level of communication, as Doug just said, but also having an action plan on how it is that you're going to respond to CWD on that local landscape, because it's that community of landowners and hunters and business owners, et cetera, that are going to be the most impacted. And so engaging them in a real, personal, honest, open, transparent way is the model, I think, to try to follow.
Have a technical question here from the floor. What is the cost of RT quick test versus IHC?
I think that's me. That's tricky to answer. So currently the IHC tests are performed by various veterinary diagnostic labs across the country, and those tests vary by state. I think in Texas it's $45, $35, somewhere in that range. $35, $40. The other thing about RT Quick and PMCA is that those are patented technologies, and there's a license associated with doing tests on that. And as far as I know, there's no company or any entity of any kind that does fee-for-service RT Quick. I think the cost is relatively low at scale, especially for RT Quick. So I could speculate. There's a retail price for RT Quick, which I've done some research on. I think would be in line with IHC to begin with, and as it scales, it could be significantly reduced. So I was talking earlier with a couple different people about the scale. So our laboratory at CSU has 12 RT Quick readers, and there's a 96 well capacity for each one. And with controls, you can run about 25 samples in each reader. So that's in a 24-hour period, that's 3,000 tests in a day. And magnify that by a working week, and you can get a lot of tests done very quickly. So under those circumstances, I think the cost would be very, very, very low compared to IHC. In the range of $10 once it's scaled to an appropriate level.
Thank you.
If I could add to that real quick, though, I think the one thing to look at would be the information you're returning on, or that you're getting for your return, I guess, bang for your buck. Especially when we hear some of these surveillance strategies. We've seen the study yesterday there, they showed up the prevalence chart, and we see what happened in, Arkansas with all of a sudden they found it, they went from having 0 prevalence to having a whole bunch of prevalence. When you're doing wildlife surveillance where you're not testing 100% of every death loss, you're testing a fraction of a percentage to begin with, and you're looking for something that's hopefully less than 1%. And now you're using IHC that we've seen, I think, in one of the presentations that, it's possibly missing 20 to 30%. There could be a lot of great information gained when you look at wildlife surveillance with using RT Quick versus IHC, just because you can catch it so much earlier in early infection. And I think when we're talking about trying to stop something from happening, catching it early, that's what we're all here today, I think, to talk about. So the return on investment or return on the money, to me, would be huge.
Here's a question for the panel, whoever wants to take it. Is there a test that can track the movement of strains of CWD specifically to help track movements among states, across state lines, et cetera?
Yeah, so we kind of addressed this at this year's USAHA, and I think there's a misconception. Okay, strains in CWD is a very gray area at this point. There's definitely suggestion that there's more than one. That's not crazy because we know there are more than one strain in other prion diseases. However, finding them and identifying them is another matter. So there was some question about Western blotting and being able to differentiate. Here's what I can tell you. CWD doesn't play that game very well. Now BSE, they've actually been able to see a difference on Western blot in the migration of the bands between the classical and the atypical. That's awesome. Scrapie, some of that works as well. What we know, and I've got a paper that's almost complete on strains, where we did some Western blot, and there are 2 very different types of CWD in elk that we saw based on the stability of the protein itself. They looked identical on Western blot. Okay, and then Dr. Justin Greenlee, who is out of ARS, so he's a federal researcher. He has got a paper coming out in sheep and CWD, and he said the same thing. It does not look different. So I think we need to understand that differentiating them is not trivial, and it takes things like conformational stability assays. So essentially what that is that a denaturing agent is put on the protein in different concentrations to see how tough it is. And there you'll see differences sometimes. And then for be a true strain, if you're going to look at the literature, what the definition of that is, you need to go further and you need to go, okay, what's the pathology looking like in the brain? Is the staining all in the same place or is it different? Putting it in a mouse bioassay, what are the incubation periods of these things that we suspect might be different? So I use the term strain to apply to those. For the work that we've got just about finished up, I'm using the word isolate because we were using some archive samples and we were able to do all of that extra work. But I think the bottom line is it is not trivial to differentiate one from the other. And I think there's a lot of work that we still need to have done in the future to understand what that means with regard to CWD. Because is it significant? There's been a little bit of work that shows that the material may behave a little differently in deer than elk as far as what's manifesting, where deer is a little bit more of a random assortment, where elk it's a little bit consistent when you put it in a mouse model. But ultimately, what does that mean for our management in disease understanding purposes? I think that's really pretty unclear.
Okay, Tammy, the next question is yours. Recognizing that early detection and surveillance is important, what management tools or techniques have you seen that have been used to find success in management?
Well, in our early years, we had our aggressive long season, gun season, so involving the hunters was a key component, and providing additional opportunity to harvest beyond the traditional just one deer. Having that opportunity on the landscape for a period of time, coupled with the additive efforts of both DNR and partner staff, USDA Wildlife Services specifically, in doing targeted culling. We did show that in areas where that targeted culling occurred over that 5-year period, we were able to drive down prevalence and density. Unfortunately, we weren't able to sustain that effort, but certainly we did start to see some measurable results.
Thank you. Jason, a question for you here. How do you enforce carcass movement restrictions?
Yeah, I think that gets back to the response I provided earlier, is to make sure that you, as an agency, have regulations that are amenable to folks doing the right thing and not moving the carcass to begin with. Enforcement of where a carcass moves across the landscape is tremendously challenging. And so it gets back to education and understanding. Most of our regulations, the attempt is to get that 80% of people who are going to comply with regulation to do the right thing, and there really is very little you can do on the tail end. So yeah, I don't think there's a good answer to that one, other than to design it in a way that folks can reasonably comply with whatever that looks like.
Okay, thank you. So we have about 20 minutes left, roughly left in the session here, and one of the things that I wanted to do was just kind of take at least one more lap around for every one of the panel members here to be able to provide sort of a closing perspective, if you will, really considering all the challenges / opportunities that Texas Deer Management offers and provides, recognizing the epi that Brian mentioned, that just made epidemiologists cringe thinking about that. And so associated with that, really wanted to give everybody an opportunity, a minute or so, maybe two, to really provide whatever kind of guidance and recommendations you could do so collectively to Texas, looking forward, again, recognizing this long-term perspective that everyone has been challenged with, thinking decades out, current management activities now, to know that if they've been validated or not. What trailing thoughts would you leave this group of stakeholders with from your experience? So we'll just start around. We'll start right here with Jason, since he has a mic.
I guess it would just be an open and honest conversation about the practices that are occurring and the relative risks they present to the long-term health of the deer herd. And an open conversation about alternative strategies and what they mean and how you can honestly mitigate those risks in a way that maintains public support. I think that's the core of what needs to happen. That's the way you get to the resolution of the feeding rule. You get to the resolution of the live movement of animals, of long-term sustainable management strategies. It's just having that open conversation about what is the true risk. I think that, the banning of urine, I think about those kinds of things in terms of the bucket. Where are the biggest holes that we got to fill, and can we develop some common understanding of those?
So, I guess I would probably just reiterate what I had said before, which would be to take a good, long, hard look at what management has been tried and what opportunities you may have to improve upon some of those things that have been tried, and place those strategies out there on the landscape to try and see whether or not you can affect some change, and look for ways to utilize the tools that you have at hand. Harvest is a very powerful management tool, and there may very well be some ways that we can optimize harvest and try to see whether or not we can do something about the disease. And I think that you guys are probably in a good position where you don't have a lot of CWD yet, and I think some of those management tools are probably more effective when you have less disease than when you're in a situation like we are with 40% prevalence, where we may not have an opportunity to make much difference. So You know, the goal is to implement that stuff early where you may have the greatest chance to actually start to limit this disease to some degree.
I honestly don't feel all that, I'm not sure that I'm the right person to ask this question of. I researched chronic wasting disease in a high prevalence white-tailed deer population. So, but that being said, I think that coming from a research background, I think learn everything you can about the disease, and building off of what Mary just said, learn what those management strategies do to your herd and see if you can actually impact lowering prevalence. I think you're in a unique position because it does seem like CWD is a fairly recent phenomenon in the state, and you're still in that golden period where maybe you can affect change. So good luck.
I'm from Texas, so I don't know if I'm supposed to answer this or not, but I do want to just say that, you know, we have experimented in the last 3 years with antemortem testing, so we are an experiment that's ongoing, and thanks to Tracy's group and others that are able to take our samples and do the research, we are gaining, you know, more information from that. I also respect the fact that hunting is a very important commodity and for our culture in the state, and also for the protection of the native herd. So I think from Texas Animal Health Commission, we want to support where we can support, and that's where our efforts have laid.
So, I'm not from Texas, but I was here for a while once upon a time. So I wish I would have completed that thought yesterday, that, you know, certainly the opportunities and the flexibility that are afforded, you know, landowners and land managers in the state of Texas are unmatched anywhere else. Along with that, by default, comes tremendous risk. But along with that risk is responsibility. I think, you know, David Sinclair will correct me. I think it's Chapter 1 of Parks and Wildlife Code identifies that wildlife, including deer, belong to the people of the state of Texas, and the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Commission are charged with looking out for the viability and integrity of that resource on behalf of the people of the state of Texas. So it has to be a balance. What are the people of Texas, the owners of that deer resource, what type of risk are they willing to accept to that resource? So it's a balancing act, and it's a tremendous challenge for the commission and for the legislature, who create statutory authority in which the Parks and Wildlife Commission, the Parks and Wildlife Department must operate. So I think as long as you keep an eye on that long-term ball, what are the people of the state of Texas willing to accommodate? Balancing risk with responsibility. You got to keep that in sight. So it's a real challenge, but good luck with it. I echo from David. Very seriously, good luck with it. I think you've got some tremendous capacity to do the right thing in Texas.
So I've been around long enough and in different aspects to now, as being a policymaker, have a full appreciation for the task that lies in front of our policymakers for the state of Texas. Because, as Brian put it yesterday, there are significant social and political pressures that go on to the decision-making process. And what I have seen is that there are interested parties on the very polar opposite ends of the spectrum, and meeting in between is extraordinarily difficult. This is something that we at the federal level deal with all the time, and it's extraordinarily difficult to do. What I would urge the various groups in here that may not always agree is try to find some sort of common goal in the center, find some sort of area you can agree on to move forward, because the push and pull makes it very difficult for your policymakers to get decisions, because there's constant discord. It's not helpful, and it'll stymie your progress. So my hat is off to the folks making policy decisions, because it's very difficult. I think we need to really appreciate the challenges they're up against to make those types of decisions.
I think that what happened in the last 2 days was very good. I learned a lot. I got a different perspective of what the disease that I study is, so I think that efforts in that sense could help a lot to move forward on this disease. Maybe a nationwide meeting similar to this one. In this meeting you have 2 people working on detection methods, but you have a lot of people, as you said, for example, working on treatment, vaccines, for example, other treatments, or trying to understand how the disease moves, how it can affect other species, whether it transmits to humans or not. So, when we go to scientific meetings, we focus on the proteins, so very technical and specific stuff, but we don't get the full picture. So something maybe nationwide, but with this focus, taking different aspects of the disease could be great. It will increase chances of collaboration, and I think that it will be better to move forward on trying to stop the spread of the disease.
We like challenges, Brian. I appreciate Dr. Wood's opening comments. She's right. I think we did a poor job at when we ignored some of the management practices or strategies that have been put into place out there. We talk about Wisconsin and their early approaches to managing this disease and what I'll call aggressive harvest strategies to try and manage this disease. And then we all know how that stopped in, I believe, 2007, and I think we have reasons why it did. But we hear little about their neighbor to the south that continued with their harvest strategies and did not see the prevalence increase in that state like we saw in Wisconsin post-2007, where you have more of a flat line. So there is some important information out there that we can't ignore, and we need to see how that could apply to situations in Texas, perhaps. I would say we have a little different situation than what was than that example I just gave, where there were higher deer densities. Where we have CWD out west in the Northwest Panhandle, we have much lower densities, and so where would a harvest strategy, for example, fall into a situation like that? Where would more harvest, I should say, fall into a situation like that? Is it even acceptable when you're already dealing with relatively low densities? And so there's probably a balance there between what's acceptable with regard to CWD prevalence when it comes to hunter acceptance or landowner acceptance versus deer densities and potentially even lower deer densities from a management strategy attempted to or designed to keep prevalence low. So there's, I would suspect, a balancing act there that we know little about at this point. And I think one thing that was made clear to me some time ago and reiterated yesterday is that doing nothing is just not an option in my book.
We had a gentleman, Don Wilson, who was headed up our game bird program many years ago, and he would say in jest, I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't believed it. And, I made the comment about how particularly for these maybe unconventional diseases for wildlife that it's fertile ground for speculation. But that's also, in the science world, that's a hypothesis, when you're speculating. And so, there's plenty of room for hypotheses, speculation. It's one of the reasons we pulled together the speakers we did to see what has been proved scientifically. But I would just urge, as one of those people that's now involved in the policy end of this is, we've got a lot of stakeholders in Texas. We have our own paradigms. Everybody has their own thought process, their own beliefs. But the only way that we're going to all be pulling in the same direction, to Dr. Nichols' point here, is for us to let down some of those guards. Ask ourselves, and when I say ourselves, I mean agency folks, NGOs, whoever you represent. Ask yourself, what if I'm wrong? Because I'll tell you this, it's not, and this is something that I think I can attribute to Dr. Ditmar, characterizing our challenge with this disease is I'm probably not going to see any negative impact in my lifetime for my hunting experiences. This disease progresses slowly. So it's probably not going to have any impact on me in the part of the world where I hunt. But it darn sure could have an impact on my kids and my grandson. So, you know, we need to look much further in the future, realize that just because we're not observing negative implications today, that doesn't mean that there are not negative implications to come. I'm very appreciative of all of our advisory groups, stakeholders, everyone that is involved, and all I would just urge is to Tracy's point is let's all continue to try to pull in the same direction and recognize we're here to protect deer, the deer resource, and hunting, and see if we can use that as a common ground to try to keep discourse to a minimum.
I guess to start, I'd like to thank the Parks and Wildlife for inviting me and having me part of this symposium. I think that's the big thing here to finding solutions is that we need to work together. We're all in this together, and that's the only way we're truly going to find a solution to this is, like I say, because it does affect deer on both sides of the fence. So working together is going to get us there. I think we need to continue at looking at, you know, the science behind this, the transmission of this disease. One thing wasn't talked about much, but I noticed yesterday one of the slides, and I wanted to pull it out and add it to mine, but didn't get a chance to. They had a slide up there and showed like the life cycle, and they actually had ticks in there, and I think there's a worm on there, and there's a few other little things and little buggers. And, you know, what else is involved in this? You know, we know how cattle fever tick is very important here in Texas. We know the longhorn tick is devastating to the east and moving across. I mean, where do ticks play in this, a role in this? I don't know. I seen in someone else's, one of the slides yesterday, they had a deer that had a radio collar. So whoever has a radio collared picture in their slides here, go back and look at that. How many of you noticed how many flies were on that deer? That's the first thing I see, because I see that within the industry as people are taking pictures and they're putting them up in sale catalogs and putting them on Facebook and everything else. I always notice at places that got a lot of flies. And like, God, you know, why don't you take care of that issue before you take pictures of your deer and advertise it, you know. But that deer was loaded with blood-sucking flies. So what happened when them flies went from that deer to the next deer? You know, there's got to be other vectors, things that we need to look at, and that's where I think this transmission study coming up, I'm anxious to see the results and the data that comes out of that. I think there's a lot more to this disease that we don't know. With that said, it takes me back to the end game on this is going to be a solution. The genetic resistance, I'm really, really excited about that. But one thing I'm probably even more excited than about that is genetic editing. This world has came a long way in genetic editing, if I'm saying that right. You know, it's not the GMO anymore. It is genetic editing. We're going under just tweaking and twisting. And we are just starting on that and just looking at that. And where that's going to get us, you know, hopefully we'll find a solution. Hopefully we can maybe get in there and just tweak out that little part. We know right now we can knock out the prion gene. That's been done already. They knocked out BSC and dairy cattle and very successful. So we could knock it out in deer as well. But I don't know if that's quite, you know, first off, I don't know if it'd be socially acceptable. When we know we battle right now GMO corn. So knocking out the prion gene is really, you know, it'd be a tough sell, I think. But genetically editing, tweaking, I think we can get away with that. And that's where I think working together, maybe we can come up with solutions, you know, and I look at how they control the screwworm or screw fly when it come into Florida. You know, they're out there sterilizing other flies and turning out there, and that they breed and crossbreed, and pretty soon there's none left. You know, maybe that's what's going to happen here is maybe we work together and we come up with this, you know, we genetically edit something that we control the CWD. And this is maybe that's Star Wars talking here, but is it something could we know we turn deer loose and liberate them here in Texas? Can we eliminate the threat and the problem through that? And I think that's where we got to go in the future is keep all options open and really truly look to the science.
So when I think about CWD, it seems like this unstoppable disease that's just marching across landscapes and disrupting so many different communities. And then you have hunting traditions and the history in these states, which seem like this immovable force or the immovable object. So you have this clash, and I don't envy the regulatory people who have this the awful task of dealing with this problem. I'm a researcher, and I think research funding is really important, and we learn valuable things, and but I don't think it's been supported in a way or in a specific way that helps. The NIH is obviously the National Institute of Health, which is for human disease research, and a lot of the funding that we've received is from there, and that seems to be more and more difficult every year to get. So I think educating the communities who this disease affects, the hunters, the landowners, and they will advocate for research and solutions. And so it's a cycle that feeds back on itself if we can really educate people about this disease. And for me, I don't really have I struggle with the ability, with the idea that I can't get out there and reach people and tell people about this disease, because every time I talk to somebody about it, sitting on a plane or on a bar stool, they're really interested in it and they really want to know more about it. And I wish I could do that to every single person in the state of Texas. That'd be a lot of bar stools, but I think that's the type of thing we need. We need advocates in the community. We need people to go out there and talk about it and really in the facts and don't spread the misinformation about this disease, because there's a lot of it out there. So that would be my wish for the future, is that everyone would be very informed and advocate for CWD research.
So many thoughts, but the primary thought that's coming to my mind is to keep the pedal down, keep the gas, keep your foot on the gas pedal, and don't let up, I guess. And it sounds easy to say. It's certainly not easy to do. And continuing to try to strike that balance between the health of the important, of the herd, and then important natural resource issue and challenge that we're all facing, and then balancing that with the interests and needs of our stakeholders. So, maintaining the gas on the pedal while also bringing your stakeholders along, and the social political side of the equation is really an important thing to try to manage for and anticipate. And if you can meet that challenge concurrently, that's, I think a great path forward. And I truly believe that in Wisconsin, while in the first 5 years our strategies were aggressive, and we did do a lot of outreach and locally and with conservation groups and beyond, but I think that if we were to take the model that we have today, which is using the citizen deer advisory councils and developing that relationship with that local community, if we would have done that back in those first 5 years, I think we'd be in a different place.
I told some folks about coming down here, some folks from Wisconsin, and one guy said, "Oh, you're going to go down and stick your head in the mouth of the lion, huh?" And I guess that was the idea that Texas is just a different world. Well, it is a different world, but you know what? I've just in the couple of days and the few folks that I've been able to speak with, have felt really good about, the attitude of openness and thoughtfulness about this. It's too important. I reiterate what I said earlier about there is that line, and that line is that it is important, that it is a problem. There's still some folks on the other side of that line who say, well, it's no big deal. And as hard as we can try to bring them along to the side of the line where the vast majority of people are, I think that's important. But I'll lay a little Latin on you from Farm Boy. Audi alterum partum, hear the other side. And the respectfulness that I've heard here is, it has made me feel really good about the future and the opportunity. So I hope that continues.
So I continue to believe that we need a better integration of science and management. And what we should strive for, and I think we do strive for, is using the science to manage these situations. So I think it's really important that you advocate for the right science that's going to help you do various things, like develop better tests, like a scientific evaluation of the management strategies that have been tried, so that we have a solid basis for saying this works in this situation and this doesn't work. And science can also help us understand better how this disease operates on the landscape, how it's transmitted amongst animals. Why are males 3 to 4 times more likely to become infected than females? We don't know, but if we did know, we might have other strategies that would help us reduce prevalence of this disease. Science can help us look forward and say what's going to happen as this genetic selection, that which we know is coming, occurs, and we get different genotypes of deer on the landscape. How is that going to potentially change what our herds look like and how reproductive they are and whether they have big antlers or any of those other kind of questions that we're concerned about? Science can help us at least get insights into strains and what's going to happen in the future with these genotypes as well, and whether they're going to be more or less susceptible to disease than they presently are. So I would ask you to advocate for doing the right science to help integrate that with your management that you need to do and help answer some of the management questions that you think are important to address as well.
So the human dimensions literature consistently points to trust as being a key variable that mediates the relationship between stakeholders and the agencies. And I think that makes a lot of sense, as agencies are the trustee of the public good. Right? We talked about wildlife as being owned by the people of the state of Texas, and the agency's entrusted to care for it, right? And we know that trust emerges from a perception that the decisions that the agencies make are done openly and honestly, and that when they make these decisions, that they're going to be efficacious. So I think it's just important to make sure that when those decisions are made, and I know that everybody does this, or at least we like to think that we're doing it this way, right? But when these decisions are made, that they take into account how different people are going to perceive these actions, that their voices are heard, and that even if they don't necessarily like the outcome about it, that they understand why it has to be done. Right?
Excellent. So before I turn it over to Clayton to close us out, one thing I want to be very mindful of is the panelists, the speakers that we had over the last day and a half, the time they gave to be here, the time they gave to prepare presentations. A 30-minute presentation is a task, but sitting on a panel like this where you don't know what's going to be coming at you is potentially more of a task. So how about a round of applause for all these people? I appreciate them.
Thank you, Corey, and thanks to you for you being nimble enough to help us compile these questions, over the last day and organize them into some thoughtful Q&A. Again, thanks to everybody. I want to reiterate, the folks that helped put this little deal together here. First and foremost, our financial support from our primary supporter, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Foundation, and Vanessa Kramer and Austin Taylor. Also, TVMDL, which is sponsoring the taping, the recording of this event, so that we'll be able to all view it again and share it with others. Of course, the Gregory family and allowing us to use this fabulous facility and allowing others to use it. And then all of our out-of-state presenters and Nathan and all of our staff from Animal Health Commission, TVMDL, TPWD that helped put this on. How about a round of applause for everyone, please? We very much, I think our closing comments, really, I covered most of what I was going to say. Very appreciative of everyone's time, particularly our folks from out of state that took the time out of their schedules to come here, be with us, share information. We've got a lot of work in front of us, but I am optimistic because we care so much about this resource that we're going to do what it takes to find solutions. So with that, happy holidays, safe travel, and God bless.